Welcome to season 7, Sal Silvester on the Future of Leadership. I am Sal Silvester, your host and executive producer of this podcast. I'm super excited to be with you in this season where we are focused on elevating human performance at work. So we're exploring what leaders and what people can do to help themselves and others improve their performance at work, almost like an athlete. An athlete trains for events using tried and tested methods to enhance their performance. Why wouldn't we do the same at work so that we can perform at our best? Today, we're focused on a really important topic, maybe one of the most important topics in terms of how we can improve how we perform at work. And it's a topic of emotional intelligence. My special guest today is an expert in this area, Dr. Robin Hills. Robin is a business psychologist, and he's the director of EI for Change, which was awarded the International Impact Company of the Year by .com magazine in 2024. Robin has taught and empowered more than 400,000 individuals across over 195 countries with the most comprehensive and detailed courses around the topic of emotional intelligence. So you're going to really enjoy this conversation. We talked about what emotional intelligence is, some practical tips on how to build self-awareness, understanding the impact of self-awareness, your inner and outer game, what people see, which is different from your internal process. I think you're going to get a ton out of this interview in terms of improving your performance at work. Let's go to the interview with Dr. Robin Hills now. Developing emotional intelligence, Robin, from my perspective, is probably one of the most, if not the most important way to improve human performance at work. And this season's all about how we improve performance at work, almost like an athlete would think about their performance on the field. You defined emotional intelligence as a set of emotional and social skills that collectively establish how well you perceive and express yourself, develop and maintain social relationships, cope with day-to-day and major challenges, and the ability to use emotional information in effective and meaningful ways. Tell me more. How do you think about emotional intelligence?
Well, I think about it even more simply than that, Sal. I think of emotional intelligence as being smart with your feelings.
Mm,
It's the way in which you combine your thinking with your emotions in order to make good quality decisions and build up authentic relationships, and then to do so in order to take action. So that for me is the essence of emotional intelligence. The broader definition I think is great, but people need to understand and think about emotional intelligence in a simpler way. And it's interpreting emotional intelligence, sorry, it's interpreting emotional data to
mm.
make decisions and to guide thinking and to build relationships. And if you think of it that way, it's still hard to do, but
Right.
it's easier to come to terms with.
Yeah, I love that. I love the simplicity of that. Say more about the emotional data. So interpreting emotional data, what does that mean, or what's an example of that?
Well, as leaders are tasked with working with data in their work environment, and most of the data that they are used to interpreting is task-related data. A lot of it is for analysis. It's mathematical formulas, it's numbers, it's figures, it's writing reports, it's delivering statements, and of course it's leading people and leading teams. Now, if we consider emotions to contain data, the intelligence in emotional intelligence is around interpreting that data in order to make good quality decisions and build up authentic relationships. So what we need to do is to encourage leaders to see emotions as relevant pieces of information, as relevant data that they can use to improve their performance. And a lot of it is interpreting emotions as being an appropriate reaction that an individual is feeling based upon changes in their work environment, in their lives. And it's understanding what that means.
So, if I'm a leader and I'm working one-on-one with someone, is it like using my intuitive sense on what someone might be feeling? Is it asking them about their emotions? How do you sort of get that data to then interpret it?
It's 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 doing both. And it's working with people in the way in which they want to be worked
Hmm.
with. So a lot of it will be intuitively trying to pick up on that person's emotions, and we do that very well as human beings. We may not be experts at it, but we can pick up on if somebody's feeling sad or if somebody's feeling angry. Some people are better at it than others.
Right.
We can also pick up if somebody is happy in a certain circumstance than others. Um, and it's then a case of saying, right, saying to yourself as a leader, this is what I am perceiving. I need to understand whether this perception is correct. So it's actually working a way of asking that of somebody
Hmm.
in order that you can empathize with somebody. Now, with empathy, it's a case of understanding the world from another person's viewpoint, another person's perspective, and understanding how that is driving their thinking and feelings.
Yes.
So empathy is a key part of emotional intelligence. And as leaders, good leaders learn to empathize.
I was reviewing parts of your book earlier in preparation for this interview, and you talked about empathy quite a bit. Some of it is, sort of natural, and some of it can also be learned. Can you talk about more about like how do we develop empathy, if that's even possible? Because some of the times I come across leaders who just say, I'm not an empathetic leader. And I'm curious about, what's the impact of that when leaders can't empathize with how others are feeling or doing?
Yeah, I think all leaders ought to be looking at enhancing and improving their coaching skills. So it's asking the right questions and it's learning to ask the right questions. What it is it's parking your own thoughts, your own interpretation, your own objectivity and your own subjectivity around a certain set of circumstances and ask the other person, what is it that you're thinking? What is it that you're feeling? How can I help you? I'm here as your leader to help you in terms of your performance. You are not here to do my bidding. We are here to work together as a team, and I'm here to support you and to be a servant to you, be a servant leader. How can I do that? Now, that is a considerable change in perspective for a lot of leaders,
Yes.
because a lot of leaders have it in their mindset that they should be an authoritative leader and they should tell people what to do and they should boss people about and be unpleasant. That's not leadership. That's just being a bully.
Hmm. I think the other piece to that too is um, there's, in one-on-ones, as an example, leaders often get to the tasks and the project management and what needs to get done, but they often miss more of the checking in, some of the questions you just mentioned. What are you thinking? How are you feeling? What are the implications of that? They often miss that people side or the check-in aspect on how people are doing.
They are missing the fundamental components of good leadership, and that's the fact that you are leading people.
Mm,
And yes, the task is important, but it's the people that are going to deliver the tasks. So, how do you motivate them? How do you influence them? How do you persuade them? And how do you do that in a way that helps you as a leader and helps them in terms of improving their performance
yeah.
and indeed their career?
Hmm. Yeah. There's other aspects. So we've kind of discussed so far, like picking up on other people's emotions and then being able to respond accordingly, empathizing with them. There's also an element of like self-awareness and then self-regulation that I think is part of emotional intelligence. How do you think about that?
Well, all of those components are vital components of emotional intelligence. They occur within our inner world. They are components of what goes on inside our head, what goes inside our body. They're parts of our psychology. They're parts of our physiology. These are things that other people are unaware of, but we should be aware of within ourselves. And self-awareness, awareness of strengths and awareness of limitations, awareness of emotions, awareness of capabilities,
Mhm.
awareness of competencies are all part of being a good leader, which is the very much the awareness side, which leads into the action and behavior. How do I regulate my emotions? How do I utilize this data, this information, in order to have to act and behave in an appropriate way? Now, nobody is seeing any of this. This is all an internal process.
Mm.
What
Mhm.
people will be seeing is what goes on in the outer world of people, situations, events, things. And within that, people should develop their emotional intelligence through an awareness of other people's emotions and thoughts, empathy, and then take the action and behavior to utilize their social skills in order to build up those relationships.
We, in our programs, we often think about if you could picture sort of three circles. The inner circle is intention. The next level circle is behavior. The third circle is perception. And people have an intention that's sort of their inner world, but other people experience their behaviors. And oftentimes the perception or the story that they make up is out of alignment with their intentions. I've very rarely worked with a leader who said, I think I'm going to be arrogant today, or I think I'll be passive today. But people notice a set of behaviors. That's the outer world. Is that aligned with how you think about that?
Yes, most definitely, because that's what people will see. They will see your how you're actually utilizing your awareness and how you're
Mhm.
utilizing your actions and behaviors. That's what people interact with. They're
Yes.
not interacting with the neural pathways that are fired up when something happens. They're not aware as to the constriction or restriction of your blood vessels around your heart when certain things happen. But you will be aware of that yourself because that will be part of an emotion that you have just experienced. Now, that's going down the biological route, which is very, very sophisticated. But as individuals, we will notice a change in our emotional state, and these changes can be incredibly subtle. So, what I'm actually doing when I'm working with leaders is say, look, let's be realistic about this. There are, depending upon which paper you read, anything between 3,000 and 27,000 emotions that
Mm.
we experience as human beings. Now, personally, I think it's the larger number rather than the smaller number, and I think even the larger number is wrong. So you're experiencing an emotion as you're sitting there listening to me, Sal. Your listeners will be experiencing different emotions. And I'm experiencing an emotion as I'm sitting here talking to you. Now, I couldn't label it, but all I can say is that at the moment I'm feeling quite pleasant.
Mm.
So, what I'm doing is I'm encouraging people to think of emotions not as positive or negative. That's a misconception. Emotions are physiological and psychological processes that help us to engage with our environment. And if you look at data, data is not positive or negative. Now, some data can be unpleasant and some data can be pleasant. So, how are you feeling? Are you feeling pleasant or unpleasant? Let's work to build up the appropriate behaviors with that emotion so that they are constructive rather than destructive.
Mm. Nice. Yeah, we find that especially as leaders rise to higher levels of leadership where they have competing priorities with their peers, being able to remain in conversation becomes more and more important. And it's the level of their emotional intelligence that typically will enable or derail them in their careers versus,
Yes.
the technical skills that they bring to the table. I'm curious about the physiological element here. So you experience an emotion. Is it possible to like be attuned to what your body is physiologically telling you to then be a signal to self-regulate in a certain way?
Yes, and again, let's keep it very, very simple because the simple things are the way forward here when we're looking at
Yes.
emotions. We experience a set of emotions physiologically and psychologically due to a change in our environment, and that will induce us either to react in one of four ways. One, we're either completely ambivalent and quite neutral about the situation, so we do nothing. Another one is where we are so awashed with the emotion, it means that we can't do anything with it, so we freeze.
Mm,
And then the other two are the ones that everybody knows. It's fight or flight.
mm,
So am I going to flee from this situation and get away from it because I find it unpleasant? Or am I going to fight this situation and stand up for myself because I find it unpleasant? So in those kind of circumstances in the workplace, we can't flee, we can't run out the room if there's something unpleasant, and we certainly aren't going to fight with our leader, not in a physical sense. So how are we going to react and behave using fight and flight? So we need to regulate our emotions according to the way in which we feel. And most people have not really realized the importance of utilizing that unpleasant feeling of wanting to fight with the leader and work in a constructive way. More often than not, they will fight with the leader and use it in a destructive way because it
mm,
feels good.
right.
Um, and then in terms of flight, people need to learn to use it in a constructive way rather than a destructive way. And the destructive way is where they become incredibly stressed
Mm,
and it's a downward spiral. And leaders need to recognize when people are being going into distress and manage it and pull them out of it and get them to work with it constructively.
You wrote in your book, I'm going to just kind of quote this paragraph. Many organizations have leaders with high IQs, but who are lacking in emotional and social intelligence. In challenging situations, low levels of these intelligences can manifest themselves as passive, aggressive, or passive aggressive communication skills, bullying, perfectionism, avoidance, denial, procrastination, blame, controlling behaviors, obsessive behaviors, using anger as a shield, refusing to ask for help, or not listening to feedback from trusted others.
Yep. And that's the way in which they are using their emotions destructively.
Mm, yeah. So what's the upside here for leaders in terms of like how does emotional intelligence or improving emotional intelligence, how can it help enhance their performance at work?
Well, if we look at it as being a very simple goal, you feel better, you perform better, and you've got better relationships. Now, emotional intelligence is hard, very, very hard to practice. But if you focus on, well, I'm going to give you a simple tip here. If leaders would focus on being kind,
Hmm.
then they will be more emotionally intelligent. Now, I've just got to say, as a caveat to that, it's not about being nice. It's about doing the right thing, and you've got to be cruel to be kind. So you've got to stand up to people. You've got to tell people when they're doing things incorrectly. You've got to tell people when they're transgressing some of your core values and some of your core principles.
Hmm.
You've got to tell people when you're feeling stressed yourself. But in terms of helping and working with other people and being a good emotionally intelligent leader, how can you do that in a kind way?
Hmm. Simple way to start developing that or improving on it. The one thing that stood out to me and something I'm working on, my team has given me feedback on is Look, if you're feeling stressed or if you're feeling frustrated, let us know before the conversation so that we can have a better understanding of what you're experiencing and how they or how I might be contributing to those emotions.
Yes, and I think emotionally intelligent leaders are aware that their emotional state is going to affect their team and their team members.
Yes.
And in the absence of any emotional cues or any emotions that they're feeling themselves, they'll take the lead from the leader. So they will look to the leader and respond to the way in which the leader is working emotionally. And emotions and the emotional climate can be driven very, very powerfully by the leader. So if the leader is feeling intense feelings of anger, the team will pick up on it. Now, then they might get angry themselves, but more often than not, they'll be fearful.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
And if the leader is feeling an intense emotion that feels pleasant, exhilaration, and joy, it'll set a happy environment for everybody to feel more relaxed, more calm, and more capable of doing productive work.
Yeah. I've always thought, as you can imagine maybe the older office environment with a whole bunch of cubicles and people looking around the corner waiting to see what kind of mood the leader's in as they walk into the room or walk into the office, and then they decide whether they're going to tell the truth or
Yes.
share the current state of the business with the leader or not. So I think there's a direct impact here on team performance, organizational performance, and whether people are willing to speak up or not.
No, that's right. I did work for a psychologist many, 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 many years ago, right at the turn of the century. And he was a very pleasant man, but he was angry all the time. And he was angry with me all the time. And I've got a very, very, very calm demeanor. And his intention there, he was going to break me at one point,
Mm,
and that was what he was focusing in on doing. And he worked very hard at it. Now, when he was out the office, great, I could get on with work.
right.
And I just went into work every day hoping that he wasn't going to be there. And I think everybody else felt the same way. So the
Yes.
minute he wasn't there, we could all relax and get on with what we were supposed to. When he was around, we were all on our guard, and we had our doors shut, and we were just trying to hope that he just wouldn't come into the room, because if he was going to come into the room, it was not going to be a pleasant exchange.
Mm,
Now, that's not good leadership. And he's
right.
a psychologist, but this is 25 odd years ago. So I
Right.
suppose we can cut him a bit of
Yeah,
slack.
he's changed or evolved over time.
I think he's probably retired by now,
Okay.
but
But it is interesting that you remember that experience 25 years later. I think there's something telling about that. People remember those experiences for a lifetime. And I think that's a message for leaders to hear. You are the topic of conversation at the dinner table at night. I know I certainly was. My father used to talk about the impact of the old man almost nightly at the dinner table. The old man was the owner of the construction company that he worked for. And you're talking about a manager that you had 25 years later. There's an impact here.
there is, and I've got to be fair to all the other managers that I've worked for. Um, when anybody asks me, "Oh, can you think of a good manager who's inspired you?" No, I can't. All I can think of is all the mistakes that the managers and leaders that I did work for, and how they made me feel. And I then go into my leadership position and know what it is that I don't like. Therefore, I'm not going to subject other people to it.
Mm,
So I have to alter my behavior according to those experiences. So I've taken some great life lessons from bad leaders.
Yeah.
Now, you've probably noticed I've not mentioned anybody's name, and I would never would do that because that's not being emotionally intelligent. But what I can do is I can draw from that experience and that behavior and tell you the story behind it and what I've learned from it.
Hmm. Well, you mentioned this idea of being kind as one, immediate way to start building, and you made the distinction between being kind and being nice as one means of building emotional intelligence. What are some other practical ideas that people um, can use to start building their awareness, the self-regulation, those social and emotional skills to stay in relationship with others? What do you recommend?
Yeah, it's a great question, Sal, because let's get away from this idea about being kind is being nice, and I think we do
Mhm.
really need to focus in on being kind rather than doing lovely things and making everybody feel happy and very pleasant. Because if somebody really has done something inherently wrong, then it needs to be brought to their attention. And a lot of leaders and a lot of managers, certainly the ones I work with quite regularly, have only learnt one way of reacting in that situation, and that's to get angry. And I've said to people, well, when you get angry with somebody, what happens? Well, they end up in a shouting match, or the other person goes incredibly quiet. And ultimately, they will leave that interaction and they will apportion blame.
Mm.
Blame on the leader, blame on the team members, blame on the client, whatever it is, they will look for somebody else to dump their emotion on. Now, in terms of certain circumstances, some leaders and some people that the leaders are leading will fight and they will argue and they will put their point across in an extremely forceful way. So, is anger the right emotion to use? Well, leaders don't know any other response. So, what I say to them is okay, look, take the way in which you're feeling, take the circumstance and bring it to somebody's attention, but don't use anger. What you need to do is you need to say to that individual, I am incredibly disappointed. I'm disappointed in you. You've let me down. You've let the team down. You've let the organization down. But more importantly, you've let yourself down. Now, somebody can't argue with that, not in the intense way that they would with anger. Yeah, they might start blaming, but they've got to take responsibility for the fact that they have induced an emotion of disappointment in the leader. So the leader is then in a position of well, power, if you want, because what the leader is then doing is making that person feel less, feel that they have let themselves down. How will they leave that interaction? Well, they'll go away from it thinking, yeah, I let myself down. I need to improve what I do. I need to improve my performance. And this is the way in which I'm going to do it. So they're not apportioning blame. They're actually working at it more constructively
Mm.
rather than the destructive behavior that anger would induce in them.
Yeah. So I'm hearing like, okay, acknowledge the feeling and the circumstance, let others know what you're feeling, but then don't use that anger emotion in the conversation itself.
Yes, I think it's very fair to say to people, look, this is making me incredibly angry. And to
Mhm.
actually say that, because
Yes.
quite honestly, nobody can argue with that.
Right.
They can argue with your rationality, they can argue with your logic, they can argue with your analysis, but they can't argue with your
With your
emotion.
emotion. Right.
So if you then say to somebody, I am feeling incredibly angry because you're behaving in this way, nobody can argue with that.
Mhm.
And this is with the way in which people really should start to use their emotional intelligence by saying, this is how I'm feeling at the moment. And a lot of leaders find that, well, it's an anathema to them. They've never done it before. So this is part of the vulnerability that the leader needs to be able to come to terms with and say, this is how I am feeling at the moment. I'm feeling fearful because I'm going into a board meeting and presenting the sales figures, which are down, and they are going to ask me to justify that. Now that is a leader seeking the right level of support from his or her people in order to be able to go into a situation that they are fearful of.
Yeah.
And to actually acknowledge that rather than, oh, yeah, everything will be all right, I'll show them.
Yeah. Right. I want to, Robin, I want to ask one other question before we wrap up today. The last year and a half has been dominated by artificial intelligence. And as you think about maybe the future of emotional intelligence, uh, tell me how you see the difference here, or maybe how emotional intelligence will change with artificial intelligence, if at all. Will it become more, less important? What's your perspective?
I think it will become much more important. And let me cough. I think emotional intelligence will become far more important in the future, and we'll become far more aware of it in the future. Let me say up front, I think artificial intelligence is a wonderful tool. It's not brilliant. We've got a long way to go. It's very, very helpful, but it is not going to take over the world. People are not going to be managed. They're not going to be led by robots. Robots do not have entrepreneurial skills. Robots have not got any strategic capability. They haven't got the ability to innovate. They haven't got the ability to create. So the robots will not take away that component of a leader's role. The other component of a leader's role is managing people. And it's everything that we've been talking about, Sal, this afternoon. It's working with people's emotions
Yes.
in order to improve their performance. Now, we work in teams, we're social animals. We are doing meaningful work. So how does a leader tap into that and work with it? Well, they use a skill that chat GPT, Gemini, any of the robots will never have, and that's empathy.
Mm. Let me summarize a couple of key points from our conversation. One, you talked about being smart with your feelings and combining your thinking with emotions. That's sort of the essence of emotional intelligence, and using that emotional data to then guide your thinking. You talked about the importance of enhancing our coaching skills, and within that, asking people, what are they thinking? What are they feeling? We talked about awareness or self-awareness and what goes on inside of our head and our body. That's an internal process, but people see the outer world. They see our actions and our behaviors and how we regulate. You talked about noticing the change in our emotional state, which can be subtle. We can be ambivalent. We can be awashed, where we freeze. We can respond in a fight or flight way. And so we have to be aware of that so that we can regulate in a way that's constructive and not destructive. And then you made a distinction between being kind and being nice. And in some ways, that's maybe the first step in building that emotional intelligence. Your emotional state will impact the people who are around you. And you also talked about taking the feelings that you have and the circumstances, bringing attention to the feelings, but not using the anger as part of the language. And as important as AI is in today's world, and probably in our future world, what won't be replicated is our emotions and empathy that we have as human beings. And maybe that's our greatest gift.
Yes, I think so. And the other thing, just to build upon that, Sal, as a final statement, why are we here? What are we doing? What in the universe? What is our place in the overall scheme of things? What is our relationship with God? however or whoever you perceive him or her to be. These are big questions that we as humans search for meaning around, and these are questions that can never be answered through AI.
Hmm. Robin, thank you so much. It's been a pleasure having you on the show today.
It's been wonderful, Sal. Thank you ever so much for having me on your show.